It's 6:51 p.m., and the Air Canada DC-9 has been in the air for over 3 hours on its way to Toronto, when the captain hears 3 quick consecutive noises.
What was that?
Let me see. It sounded right behind my seat.
Let me handle it.
3 circuit breakers had tripped, which the co-pilot tried to reset without success. He repeated the attempt several times, but the circuit breakers kept tripping again and again.
It's the bathroom breakers. For the vent fan?
Well, if the bathroom doesn't work, it doesn't work. We're halfway there already.
June 2nd, 1983. Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, Texas, USA. It's a few minutes past 4 p.m. in Dallas, and here, Air Canada Flight 797 is accommodating the last passengers who will be departing for Montreal, with a stopover in Toronto. It appears that this time the plane will have only 41 passengers, barely half of the seats available on this DC-9. This 15-year-old DC-9 has had numerous issues over the years, with 76 incident reports open. Just a few years ago, in 1979, this aircraft was involved in a serious incident when shortly after takeoff, the rear pressure bulkhead separating the passenger cabin from the tail of the plane suffered a massive decompression. The powerful decompression caused the tail cone of the plane to blow out, damaging both the flight control cables and the cables transmitting the pilot's inputs to the engines. After the accident, the plane was repaired, but it was never the same. Many cables had to be cut and spliced to access the damaged structure during the repair. At the controls of Flight 797 is Captain Donald Cameron, 51 years old, a veteran pilot with over 13,000 flight hours. He is joined by First Officer Claude Ouimet, 34 years old with 5,600 hours of experience, half of which are on DC-9 aircraft. They are accompanied by 3 cabin crew members, lead flight attendant Sergio Benetti, flight attendant number 2 Laura Kayama, and flight attendant number 3 Judy Davidson. In total, there are 46 people aboard the Air Canada DC-9. The crew has noticed that one of the passengers is the famous Canadian folk singer Stan Rogers. At the age of 33, Rogers was already possibly the most well-known folk singer in Canada, but by all accounts, his career was just beginning, and his audience was rapidly growing, especially abroad. Although it was said he hated flying, the demand for his performances across North America was so high that he could hardly avoid air travel. At 4:25 p.m., the DC-9 began taxiing down the runway. They took off without issues, climbed without incident to 33,000 feet, and set course for Toronto. It's now 6:51 p.m., and the Air Canada DC-9 has been in the air for over 3 hours on its way to Toronto when the captain hears 3 quick consecutive noises.
What was that?
Let me see. It sounded right behind my seat.
Let me handle it.
3 circuit breakers had tripped, which the co-pilot tried to reset without success. He repeated the attempt several times, but the circuit breakers kept tripping again and again.
It's the bathroom breakers. For the vent fan?
Well, the bathroom doesn't work, it doesn't work. We're already halfway there.
For the next 8 minutes, there were no further signs of any problems. The pilots noted the failure in the logbook, contacted Indianapolis Center, and chatted for a while about the weather. At 6:59 p.m., the captain tried to reset the circuit breakers again, estimating that enough time had passed for the bathroom vent fan to cool down, but nothing changed. They tripped again. They didn't give it much more thought and continued their flight, ignoring the problem. Meanwhile, in the back, a passenger seated in the last row called over flight attendant number 3, Judy Davidson, to ask about a strange smell that had started to permeate the rear of the cabin. Davidson agreed that there was a peculiar smell of smoke or burning wires in the air, took out a fire extinguisher and opened the bathroom door. To her surprise, smoke immediately pushed her back. It was thick in the air and rapidly escaping through the gaps between the wall panels. Despite the amount of smoke, she couldn't see any fire to attack with the extinguisher. She quickly relayed this news to the other 2 flight attendants, and they entered the cockpit to notify the pilots of the situation. The captain instructed his co-pilot to go to the bathroom to see what was happening. Meanwhile, a passenger seated in the front rows overheard the conversation and asked for a few drinks of any alcoholic beverage for himself and his companion. If the reaction of the crew and passengers seems too casual, it's worth noting that in 1983, fires in airplane bathrooms were a relatively common occurrence. Although smoking in the bathrooms had been prohibited since the mid-1970s, it was still allowed in the cabin, and occasionally passengers would cause minor fires by discarding poorly extinguished cigarettes into the bathroom trash bins. These trash bins were designed to contain a fire, and on this DC-9 in particular, the bins were even equipped with heat-activated automatic fire extinguishers, so while such a fire would require a response, it wouldn't necessarily have been an emergency. In the back of the plane, lead flight attendant Benetti took the fire extinguisher and opened the bathroom door. There were no signs of flames, but smoke was coming out of every conceivable opening. Although he wasn't sure it would have any effect, he emptied the contents of the extinguisher into the sink, covering every inch of the small room, and then closed the door. The flight attendants decided to move the passengers to the front rows of the plane. With so many empty seats, it was better to keep people away from the bathroom area. The assistant Benetti reported back to the pilots about his actions, and noted that things seemed to be improving since the smoke was starting to dissipate. Nevertheless, the captain sent First Officer Wimay to check the status of the plane. As the first officer approached the lavatory, he indeed saw that the smoke was much less dense at that moment. However, when he went to open the lavatory door, he had to immediately pull his hand back. The handle was extremely hot. He quickly returned to the cockpit.
Captain, there's a lot less smoke, but I don't like this situation at all. We must have a fire somewhere. The lavatory handle is burning hot. It's impossible to open the door without getting burned.
Okay, take a seat and declare an emergency. We need to start descending before this gets worse.
Moments after this conversation, at 19:06, before the first officer could declare the emergency, the main warning light illuminated, indicating a failure of the left side electrical generators.
We have an electrical problem and a possible fire in the lavatory. We could lose communications at any moment. We need to descend quickly. "40 seconds after this communication, both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder stopped recording simultaneously. Shortly after that, the main caution light illuminated again,
and the right side and emergency electrical generators lost power. Most of the pilot's instruments began to fail. Thinking quickly, First Officer Uime reached out and activated the emergency power switch, transferring emergency power to the main battery. This brought the instruments back online. Realizing they were suddenly in a desperate situation, Captain Cameron initiated a rapid emergency descent. Meanwhile, First Officer Ume radioed the Indianapolis Center and declared an emergency, telling the controller that Flight 797 had a fire on board and was descending. After identifying the aircraft, the controller responded that the nearest airport was Cincinnati, less than 25 nautical miles northeast. They were too close for the 33,000 feet they were flying at, so they would have to descend very quickly to avoid losing time. Captain Cameron managed to achieve a descent rate of over 5,000 feet per minute, but due to the escalating failures, he had lost control of the horizontal stabilizer, which would normally allow him to trim the aircraft to maintain a nose-down attitude. With the stabilizer still set for cruise flight and unable to move, the only way the captain could continue the descent was by holding the control column forward with considerable force. But within minutes, another problem arose. The hydraulic system began to fail, making the captain's effort even more strenuous. As if the situation weren't already complex enough, things were about to get worse. The smoke reappeared, this time much more intensely, and started to fill the cockpit. The pilots quickly put on their oxygen masks while hearing the rest of the people on board coughing and gasping. The flight attendants used a portable oxygen bottle to assist the passengers who were struggling the most. The plane was not going to reach the desired altitude in time, so they were forced to make a left turn to buy some time while continuing the descent. When it seemed that things couldn't get any worse, the auxiliary power failed and the pilot's instruments went out again. Now, with the cockpit filled with smoke, the only way to see the attitude, speed, direction, and other essential data was to use the smaller, mostly analog instruments in the center of the cockpit. Shortly after, the captain struggled to align with the runway. The fire trucks were in position, and finally, at 1922, the DC-9 landed in Cincinnati. The captain applied maximum braking, causing the landing gear tires to burst, but the plane came to a safe stop in the middle of the runway. In the smoke-filled cabin, the relief was palpable. They thought the worst was surely over. Little did they know, the horror was just beginning. As soon as the plane stopped, a frantic evacuation began. The flight attendants opened both forward exits, while passengers opened 3 of the 4 overwing exits, and people began to escape the aircraft. The smoke was so dense that passengers couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. The only way to see or breathe was to drop to the floor and crawl. The exits were invisible, hidden behind a cloud of black smoke as passengers struggled to find them. In the cockpit, the pilots shut down the engines and tried to exit through the galley, but they couldn't see anything. First Officer Wime escaped through the open cockpit window, using the escape rope to lower himself to the ground. However, Captain Cameron fainted and couldn't follow. The first officer alerted the firefighters, who sprayed the captain with their hoses through the window to wake him. Thanks to this, he was able to escape through the window as well. Then, just 90 seconds after the plane came to a stop, the entire passenger cabin erupted in flames. An unstoppable wall of fire advanced from the rear of the plane, consuming everything in its path. Firefighters tried to fight it, but there was nothing they could do. Captain Cameron, who had escaped through the window seconds before the explosion, would be the last person to leave the plane alive. While firefighters worked to control the blaze, the flight attendants lined up the passengers and began to count. Their grim tally totaled only 18. While all 5 crew members had survived, 23 of the 41 passengers did not escape the plane, succumbing to the smoke, toxic gases, and intense heat. For the pilots and flight attendants, it was a devastating blow. Despite their successful effort to land the plane, half of the people on board had died during the evacuation. Among those who didn't make it out was the singer Stan Rogers. What had happened? What caused the plane to suffer an electrical failure and end up in flames? Since the accident occurred in the United States, it was investigated by the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB. In the CVR, investigators heard 8 electrical arcing sounds starting at 1848. The arcing sounds recurred every time the crew attempted to reset the lavatory circuit breakers. Both pilots testified that they did not hear any arcing sounds, and the NTSB concluded that these sounds would be inaudible to the flight crew. Ultimately, the NTSB could not determine the origin of the fire, although it is possible that it was generated by a short circuit resulting from the pilot's attempts to restore the circuit breakers to their operational position. In August 1984, the NTSB issued a final report that, while praising the captain for exhibiting excellent flying skills without which the aircraft and everyone on board would have perished, concluded that the flight crew's delayed decision to initiate an emergency descent contributed to the severity of the accident. As a result of this accident and other in-flight fire incidents on passenger aircraft, the NTSB issued several recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, including smoke detectors in lavatories, installation of automatic fire extinguishers next to and in lavatory waste containers, emergency floor level or near floor level lighting bright enough to penetrate dense smoke in the event of a fire, raised markings on overhead compartments indicating the location of exit rows to help passengers locate these rows in case of visual impairment,